Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 2025 Hugh D.T. Williamson Lecture. It's great to see everybody here. Before we get started this evening, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are gathered on right now. That's the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and celebrate the fact that all across this country, in all these different areas, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been and are the very first scientists and very first artists. My name is Matt Coffey. I will be your MC for this evening. I am a proud Wiradjuri man, but I grew up on Aranda country in Central Australia. Right now in my role, I work at WEHI, which is the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research, based right next to the Melbourne Royal Hospital. And I manage there the partnership between WEHI and Deadly Science. Deadly Science is a leading First Nations charity organisation that focuses on improving STEM outcomes for young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students all across the country. Science Gallery Melbourne has been very proud to work with and be supported by the Hugh D.T. Williamson Foundation for many years now, 8 years in fact, and this marks the 7th lecture in this lecture series, which is very exciting. Science Gallery is very proud to be supported by the foundation. On a personal note, I am not your MC this evening because my initials are MC, although it is a contributing factor. I used to work here at Science Gallery. I started working as a mediator on the Science Gallery floor, and then I transitioned into a role in their education team where I worked designing and delivering school-based programs. That role was actually funded by the Hugh D.T. Williamson Foundation. So I'm really grateful for their long-term support of me. It's allowed me to have the career that I have today over at WEHI and Deadly Science. So I'm very grateful for that. Tonight's lecture is Laying Down the Law with Dr. Michaela Saunders. Before we get into the main event, I would like to invite Stephen Newton from the Hugh D.T. Williamson Foundation, the chair, to come up and say a few words and introduce Michaela. Thanks for being here, everyone. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Matt, for your kind introduction and welcome. And welcome everyone this evening to the 2025 Hugh D.T. Williamson Lecture. As you've heard, my name is Stephen Newton and I serve as the chair of our foundation. I'm joined here today by two of the other trustees of the foundation, Susan Hughes and Dr. Lucia Boxler. We're also joined by the Acting National Manager, Charitable Trusts for Equity Trustees, Grant Hooper. I bring an apology from two other trustees, James Gard and Natalie Chanley, who are not able to be with us today. I also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples and traditional owners and custodians of the land and waterways on which we live. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people represent the world's oldest living culture, a culture we seek to celebrate and to respect. We honour and pay our respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we gather today, and pay our respects to elders past and present and to all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here now. We are grateful for their strength and for their wisdom. The Hugh D.T. Williamson Foundation is an inaugural supporter of Science Gallery Melbourne. Hugh Williamson was born in Ballarat. He left school at the age of 16 and joined a local bank. In 1961, he retired as General Manager of the ANZ Bank, a remarkable career. During his working life, he took a keen interest in helping those in need. He was a fine judge of people and of causes and initiatives. He devoted the last 20 years of his life to supporting a wide range of organisations that sought to better the lives of those living here in Victoria. And with the establishment in his will of the foundation that bears his name, he put in place a means to help ensure that this important contribution was carried on into the future. And so our foundation aims to support and to strengthen communities across Melbourne and rural Victoria by enabling the establishment of educational opportunities, building leadership skills, addressing health and environmental concerns, as well as identifying ways to enhance the cultural life of all Victorians through the arts. Simply put again, the Foundation exists to promote the well-being of the community here in Victoria. We recognise too the key role that Indigenous knowledge and practice play in this now and will do into the future. So we are very pleased to partner with Science Gallery Melbourne in supporting opportunities and pathways for young Indigenous people. I am now pleased to introduce Dr. Michaela Saunders. Michaela is the author of the speculative fiction collection Always Will Be, published in 2024. She has won prizes for fiction, poetry, essays and research, including the Elizabeth Jolly Short Story Prize and the Udjuru Nunakal Indigenous Poetry Prize. She is a postdoctoral fellow at Macquarie University, researching First Nations speculative fiction. Michaela is also part of the expert advisory group for Sci-Fi Mythologies Transformed, the exhibition currently being shown here in the gallery. Today, Michaela will explore her groundbreaking research on First Nations speculative fiction. She will delve into key subgenres and share how these genres allow First Nations writers and readers to reimagine and reflect on past, present and future issues. And she will also be signing books after the lecture, so do stay around and talk with her. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Michaela Saunders to give the 2025 Hugh D.T. Williamson Lecture.
Jingiwala, Witherbayan, good to see you all here tonight. I'm very grateful to be here in Naarm, grateful to the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung community and the broader Kulin Nation as I walk with respect on this beautiful country. I'm also grateful to the Darug and Bundjalung nations where this research and writing took form, especially to elders and all the ancestors, some of whom are mine too, who nourished their countries and each other for millennia, and still do to this day despite the last few hundred apocalyptic years. It's because of their care of country through culture that we're all able to enjoy being here today, in spite of colonial destruction of land, water and people's liberty and sovereignty. Yahweh, I'm especially grateful to my community, the Tweed Guris of Bundjalung Jugan, who brought me up in Bundjalung culture. Boogle Bear. I want to thank everybody, Matt and Stephen, for your beautiful introduction, the board members and everybody at Science Gallery. These talks don't just happen. There's a lot of moving parts and they're often set in motion months and months beforehand. So thanks everyone who worked to bring me here today. My name's Michaela Saunders and I'm a postdoc research fellow at Macquarie University. My project is called Laying Down the Law, a survey of speculative, visionary and imaginative fiction. Over 3 years, I'm very lucky to be researching, writing and critiquing blackfella spec fic, and I'm currently writing a scholarly book on the subject. Each of the 7 chapters of my book corresponds to a subgenre of spec fic, and in this talk, I want to outline these chapters and discuss some of the key texts within them and what they tell us about the subgenre, how our writers are using it to tell our stories, and some of the common themes and tropes that seem to be part of the collective consciousness of Black authors in these genres. Wiradjuri Wiradjuri scholar critic Janine Lane argues that literary movements flourish and become strong through critique and scholarship that grows with it and around it. Woolly Woolly writer Lisa Fuller agrees with her that it's important that robust and culturally grounded Indigenous spec fic scholarship develops alongside the creative work so that the nascent fields are nurtured within a healthy discourse. And so to answer Janine and Lisa, for each of my 7 chapters, I'm developing some cultural genre theory, and I'll touch on that tonight and how it differs from mainstream genre theory that tends to supersede other readings of our work. I want to highlight that there's often a lot of overlap with the genres that I'm going to talk about. So rather than thinking of them as like discrete categories, let's think of them as fuzzy sets with permeable borders that are often seeping across each other. For example, there's often a lot of overlap between science fiction and futurism, though sci-fi isn't always futuristic and futurism isn't always focused on tech, so we can parse these apart to a degree. Many black spec fic texts cross commonly agreed boundaries too, not really respecting the white man's fences, if you can believe it. For example, the first published spec fic text, The Kadaicha Sung from 1990, by Sam Watson, who was a staunch Birragubba and Mananjali author and activist who passed away in 2019. His novel actually draws on almost every one of the subgenres of spec fic. The fantastic elements are very cultural, although they are made up. There are horror and gothic elements, and climate speaks through country in the book. Another early example is Land of the Golden Clouds by Archie Weller, a Noongar writer from 1998. This is a science fantasy novel with horror elements and also a very critical climate world too. A more recent example is Alexis Wright's The Swan Book, which is set 100 years into a climate-changed future, and it's apocalyptic and dystopian, also with gothic and weird elements such as the swans. So I'm going to discuss these texts and many others from my edited anthology, This All Come Back Now, as well as other texts. And my anthology, This All Come Back Now, I published it because I am very passionate about this topic, and I put it out in the world to show the incredible work that our writers have been doing for over 30 years in this space. Let's look at these 7 spec fic subgenres now, some of which I've thought about very deeply, and others I'm still figuring out what I think. I'm going to start with climate fiction, or cli-fi, because for Indigenous peoples, all stories begin with country. And as climate change reveals, all stories will end with country too. Cli-fi might be thought of as a new genre, but let's go back much further in time to our cultural stories. The role of country in shaping Indigenous literature is as old as time itself. All of our creation stories tell of life-giving climate change. In the beautiful and powerful introductory chapter of Alexis Wright's Carpentaria from 2006, the ancestral rainbow serpent comes down and scores its body into the land and creates waterways and new life in its wake. If we consider that all First Nations creation stories begin in similar ways with life-giving climate change, where ancestor spirits create water, animals, and people from the formless void, then it would be correct to say that contemporary Western cli-fi texts tend to feature life-destroying climate change. And actually, many of our ancient cultural stories do warn about what can go wrong, like these contemporary stories, when country is abused. A very well-known example is a dreaming story called Tiddalik the Frog. It's from the Gunai-Kurnai people, which shows the devastation that can happen when greedy entities hoard water meant for the land and all other life. Common cli-fi definitions focus on disaster, right? For our people, climate catastrophe is nothing new, and it's not the stuff of fiction. If we take cli-fi to be any story that features a changing or threatening climate as inextricable from the story, then to Aboriginal people, all stories set on our continent after 1788 are climate stories. The climate grief that many Australians increasingly share with us and feel in the wake of local bushfires, floods, and global warming has been felt acutely by Aboriginal people since 1788, when the first swathes of forests were cut down to make houses and farmland in eastern Darug country, polluting fresh water, annihilating abundant populations of fish, birds, and other animals, destroying the intricate cultural systems that kept it all in balance. For more than 2 centuries, Aboriginal people, in our deep relationships to country, encompassing attendant rights and responsibilities, we've seen unfathomable ecocide enacted hand in glove with our own attempted genocide, and we've collectively mourned and fought for country the whole time. So really, any Aboriginal story that focuses on country deals with climate too, whether ancestral life-making climate change or colonial capitalism's destructive changes. For our people, country has consciousness, and our writers imagine this in different ways, as well as country's response to its own killing. Country often has agency through climate and weather events, through the actions of plant and animal emissaries, and through ancestral spirits and other creatures. Yugambeh writer Ellen Van Nieven's novella Water is set in a near-future Russell Island off the coast of Brisbane. The government in this story are about to create a separate Australia too, where Aboriginal people will soon be segregated, at the expense of the island's ancestral inhabitants. This story focuses on the relationship between the human Caden and the plant person Larapinta, showing how their fascination with each other grows as its own story within the broader saga. Climate change is central to blackfella spec fic works, such as the aforementioned Swan Book and Crystal Hurst's haunting and beautiful story Lake Mindy, which follows a small family of climate refugees across a burnt and desolate Wiradjuri country as they seek the fabled Lake Mindy, where they believe rebirth and renewal will be waiting for them. Hurst's story collapses multiple genres together, like climate fiction and ghost story, and it offers us a fresh and cultural take on the apocalypse, particularly in the ways that the characters comfort each other in crisis. Let's now look at science fiction or sci-fi, one of the more recognisable spec fic subgenres. Sci-fi generally looks at the impacts of new technologies, or novum, on people, on society. Let's think about our cultural stories where the first people were given fire, or taught to hunt, or fish, or weave. The characters are transformed by the tech and the impacts of what make the narrative move along. Contemporary sci-fi is also the stuff of exciting, forward-thinking technology and its impacts on the world of the story. And often these can be philosophical exercises or experiments, considering the ethics and implications of technology, say for space travel or time travel, really no different to our cultural stories. And the thing is, for its early history, the stuff of science fiction was our realities. Think about first contact with alien cultures and subsequent invasions, annihilations from advanced technology, biological weapons, experiments in eugenics. So think about the function of monsters and superheroes. Early Western science fiction and colonial expansion went hand in hand, justifying and informing each other. With many common space stories, it's often an escapist story set when life on Earth is too much or not possible. I took this trope on in my story, Future in the Stars, where 2 lovers muse about how most of these stories were written by white fellas and why, for Indigenous people, leaving our countries, our homelands, our planet is unthinkable. The characters compare this to the dispossessions our old people faced in recent memory. Interesting for me is that when our writers do write into first contact themes, it's often us being visited by different humans or other creatures rather than us exploring, invading, making contact with unknown people on their lands. Below the Line by Eric Wilmot from 1991 explores a violent military invasion and dividing of the continent by some of our human neighbours. Archie Weller's Land of the Golden Clouds has a more friendly group of technologically advanced Jamaicans coming in peace. Mariana Salem's sci-fi story When From is a contact story too, but with our own people in the past. It's a satirical corporate dystopia. Salem extrapolated from the COVID pandemic and Hollywood's proclivity for filming in Australia at the time, and added some time travel and mixed in a very strong dose of Aboriginal cynicism for good measure. Carceral technologies have been explored by Alison Whittaker, Charlene Alsop and myself, which I think is part of understanding our recent cultural load. Set in a future urban Redfern, The Centre by Alison Whittaker is a disturbing thought experiment, grounded in cultural and historical fact, that grapples with a truly blackfella future in ways that poke fun at the present. In the stories, blackfellas are incarcerated in a VR cloud, but they soon come to prefer this place over real life. And particularly, I think, cutting is Whittaker's climate change future in this world. She reckons with abolition in a gamified reality, which is reminiscent of all the quick fix, sloganistic government programs that are constantly dreamt up to solve our problems. Charlene Alsop, in The Great Undoing, her recent novel, conceives of a nanotechnology called blood talk, which is injected into people from birth, and it allows them to conduct their business in this new hypertech world. Think about everything that you can do on your phone, but it's kind of in your blood. Banking, travel, study, communication, you name it. What could go wrong, right? Well, Alsop says everything, and the whole world shuts down once this tech is taken out. Some of our writers use sci-fi to think about posthumanism, asking who or what is human. This All Come Back Now ends with two considerations of these futures. Hannah Donnelly's microfiction, After the End of Their World, encapsulates a whole world in less than 500 words. Sometime in the past, disappearing humans created the Sisters of the Skylands, non-human custodians of country. When these sisters visit Earth to conduct a cultural burn, they are forced to feel grief for the first time, and they learn of its transformative power. The anthology closes with a beautiful lyrical story called Protocols of Transference by Catherine Gledhill Tucker, who's a tech activist, a Noongar tech activist. The way the narrator yarns to the AI in the story with such affection and sadness and gravity in this post-human future is really moving. In the author's words, this story, quote, comes from attempting to reconcile cultural protocols of knowledge sharing with the enormous capacity for technology to consume, learn, proliferate beyond our intentions. There is some convergence too with the mechanisms of cultural protocols and the technical protocols computers use to exchange data, end quote. Indigenous futurism is a term coined by Grace L. Dillon in 2003 to describe a subgenre of spec fic that grapples with issues that Indigenous peoples might face in the future. It's a nod to Afrofuturism, and Dillon further theorised in her edited collection Walking the Clouds, which is brilliant, that these are stories that toy with linear temporality as a way to talk about all times and how they're woven together, the way that we conceive of time in our cultural way as blackfellas. A few years ago, I theorised blackfella futurism as a local offspring of a global Indigenous futurism and a sovereign-minded genre of spec fic. Of course, blackfella futurism can straddle other genres, but these are stories that explicitly think of us as a people in the future. Futures that can loosely be grouped as either utopian, dystopian, or apocalyptic, or post-apocalyptic, or a combination of these. Studying these texts, we can think about what our hopes and fears are for who and how we might be in the future. The few utopian stories that our people have written tend to present uncolonised communities living lifestyles similar to how our ancestors would have lived. However, many blackfella futurism texts are essentially dystopian, either replicating social structures that are similar to our past or present world, or exaggerating these realities into satire. In these stories, we are often dispossessed, oppressed, or otherwise struggling for sovereignty. The post/apocalyptic genre can also be dystopian or utopian, depending who you are, and it can play with these assumptions. As history has shown, one group's apocalypse is another group's golden age. In many of the post/apocalyptic stories, the precipitating events are catastrophic. And so this can be read as an equalising genre, where colonising cultures may soon share an experience of world-shattering with us, rather than them inflicting it on us. Archie Weller's sprawling futurist novel Land of the Golden Clouds from 1998 is set on a hot, irradiated continent 3,000 years into the future, where people live in distinct cultural clans. And it's a fantastic example of a hopeful yet post-apocalyptic future, with aspects of utopia and dystopia too. His chapter, The Purple Plains, focuses on the Aboriginal keepers of the trees, who Weller imagines living far into the future the way our ancestors did. This chapter is full of creation stories from all over the continent, which shows the survivance of our cultures through time, with a bit of romance and danger thrown in. I was inspired by Weller, Ellen Van Neerven, and other black spec fic writers when I wrote my own first spec fic story, Terranora, which is set in my own community in a future Tweed in a saltwater mangrove world. Terranora is my queer take on the classic A Stranger Comes to Town setup. The story explores belonging and relationships inside a tight-knit Guri clan who've reasserted their sovereignty in a dizzyingly climate change future. Okay, we're moving now into territory that I haven't thought as deeply about, that I'm still thinking through. And to me, this is some of the more exciting stuff, because when I'm beginning research, I always find the questions more interesting than the answers. Fantasy can be quite a contentious label, I think, for our people, though for many of our writers are using it intentionally. The problem comes from history again, when many of our cultural stories are labelled myths and legends, with the denigration that those labels have accumulated like old dust. Stories of powerful spirits, magic, sorcery, talking animals, you name it. Our cultural stories have these. But the difference with contemporary fantasy is that the author has created a new world, or totally imagined our real one, replete with new magic or supernatural content. Stuff that can't be explained by the science of the world, that operates outside its laws. Stuff that may nod to or draw from traditional culture, but it couldn't be classed as traditional culture by any stretch of the imagination. That is, these stories are invented by one writer rather than a collective community of storytellers passing the story down through tens of thousands of years, like our cultural stories. Still, often when our writers are writing fantasy, they do use cultural elements, though this is no different to any other culture that writes fantasy. Amberlynn Quay-Mulliner's recent young adult novel, Liar's Test, is set in a different world to ours, a made-up one, though in The Tree Singers there are many parallels to our own histories and cultures. Quay-Mulliner uses this other world to look at ours in a clear and simplified way. I also mentored an incredible emerging Broome writer, Tani Carter, on her fantasy manuscript, which is also set in a made-up world where she looks at these issues in a defamiliarised way. And I hope this story finds publication soon. There's not a lot of black fantasy, so yeah, it's an exciting, I think, new genre. In contrast with Mariana Salem's sci-fi time travel story I spoke about earlier, sometimes our writers use fantasy to visit our old people in the past. Lystra Rose's The Upwelling is set in this here and now, near where I grew up in Yugambeh country on Yellowgull or Burleigh Headland. And it's also set in that same place, but sometime long ago, as the protagonist Kira opens up a portal to the past by surfing the perfect barrel. Another portal to the past story is Song of the Nawadina by Marie McCarthy Yolnu, where the storyteller glimpses a vision of her old people and then is able to cross over and visit with them for a while. Our people seem to love superheroes too, with the TV show Cleverman being a really good example, where two brothers fight for the title in a real-world futuristic Redfern, where cultural forces and powers have been made real. Lockie Little's short story, Snake of Light, is set in a country pub, a place often associated with small minds and big violence. And Lockie plays with audience expectations of where the danger comes from through his queer anti-hero protagonist. This unearthly urban fantasy speaks to both our ancient spiritual ways and to contemporary small-town problems, while also being a satisfying tale of revenge. I haven't gone too far in my exploration of blackfella horror yet, but one question I keep chewing over as I read is, what does horror mean to people whose real-life histories are horror stories? When I think about my family, my community history, I see the violence of massacres and the gore of headhunting and taking body parts as trophies, the terror of stealing children from their families, the body horror of eugenicist logic, of blood quantum legislation, of forced sterilisation. On one hand, horror is one of the most realistic languages we can use to express ourselves, yet, as Black American novelist and critic Brandon Taylor says, why would we need horror as a genre when it's our reality? Speaking of his own people, I can draw parallels when Taylor says Black people have already experienced all the horrors of slavery and historical abuse. Why do we need to exaggerate it? Best to invent new horrors then, or tap into old ones, rather than using horror tropes as allegory for racism, which is all too real and mundane. Still, like other subgenres, our cultural horror stories predate the horrors of colonial abuses. Many of our old stories use creatures as warnings to stay away from certain places or to be home at certain times. Kayla Murray explores a father-son dynamic in his very fun and creepy bush horror story, In His Father's Footsteps. This story is based in Murray's home country, up north of Broome, and the texture of his world is really finely rendered. It's a beautiful invocation of the bush and the mangroves and the delights of crabbing seen through the eyes of a moody teen. In this story, a cultural creature from stories Murray heard growing up kind of features, but not really. I'll get to that in a second. In Lisa Fuller's story Myth This, a Murray family goes camping on a cold winter weekend. This is another bush horror story that speaks to some of the same themes as Murray's, but with a slight shift in tone. This too is really a story about family, and Fuller's characters are vibrant and relatable. Both stories allude to cultural creatures while respectfully not exploiting them for outsider audiences, which I think is a problem some of our writers have, or not a problem, but it's an ethical conundrum that we face when we're writing culturally for outsiders. Two urban horror stories I want to mention are The Boundary by Nicole Watson and Borderland by Graham Ackhurst. Both of these stories feature cultural entities that wreak revenge on behalf of blackfellas in the story, and often against other blackfellas who turn on country and community. In The Boundary, Redfeather is a clever man spirit who kills judges, lawyers, and sellout blackfellas on behalf of his human descendants when their native title claim is dismissed. Borderland's terrifying spirit Dogman haunts the protagonist and another character when they both become involved in producing propaganda for a mining company intent on fracking their ancestral country. While we think of horror as inspiring terror, dread, and fear, ghost stories in the Gothic tend to invoke sadness and despair. Ghosts in spec fic often represent unfinished business, like unresolved guilt, anger, or sadness. The Gothic is a genre perfect for us as wronged people on a brutalised land. Closing Time by Samuel Wagon Watson, who is the son of Sam Watson, who wrote the first spec fic novel. It's his urban ghost story, and it's an atmospheric exploration of father-son relationship and the ways that the past seeps into the present, perhaps alluding to some of the author's feelings about his own dad having passed recently. It's set in autumn 2020, which is another very, Gothic time because it channels the global ambient anxiety from the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Evelyn Aralewin's moving and mythic story, Moyam, A Transgression, is set in between this world and the other one. It's a haunting story narrated by a young ghost in Aralewin's unique and powerful prose. This is Aboriginal Gothic, where the sadness is born from intimate knowledge of place and people and what has been done to both, not horror arising from the land itself as a mysterious entity, as with regular Australian or Western Gothic. Plains of Promise, which is Alexis Wright's first novel from 1997, is another Aboriginal Gothic where white ways have run so roughshod over black ways that land and people are haunted and to be feared by even our own people. The Aboriginal character Elliot embarks on an ancestral journey, but he's terrified of the land and spirits as white religion has brainwashed him. Also, white treatment of land and people has ruined both in nightmarish ways. Quote, "The night might have been enjoyed once. He thought of the days when spirits and the black people would have spoken to each other. But the black man's enforced absence from his traditional land had inspired fear of it. They had to alter old, ongoing relationship with the spirits that had created man and once connected him to the earth." End quote. Tommy Norley is a short story by John Morrissey, which works brilliantly as a Gothic, where trespassers, both settlers and blackfellas alike, live in fear of the land and the menacing natives that belong to it, whose violent deeds torment them thereafter. This story was told to John by his father and presumably originates from the Kalkadoon community where they're from. Tommy Norley, the character, is born to a black mother and absent white father on a North Queensland station where he grows up and later works, before leaving to travel with a new white boss. One night on the road, deep in some other blackfellas country, they've never been there before, the pair hear a song of warning emanating from the bush, and suddenly a warrior comes out of the darkness and attacks Tommy's boss. Tommy kills the warrior, and then he and his boss tie the warrior's body to the nearby mangroves. The song that comes from the bush has now turned to one of mourning, and Tommy begins to envision black hands coming for him in the darkness. He and the boss soon part ways, with Tommy making his way back to the station, resuming his old job and starting a family. But he remains haunted by his deed, and watchful too, especially when he hears news that of his old boss's very unfortunate accidental death, which he knows to be the work of those black hands that once tormented him. As allegory and as Gothic, Tommy Norley reminds us that colonial violence entangles us all as its effects reverberate across time and across space, through land and through people, and nobody gets to pretend otherwise. My last chapter, my last subgenre, we have weird fiction, a term reserved for those speculative stories that are rooted in cosmic horror and skim across other non-realist genres without being beholden to their conventions. It's the spec-fic stuff that doesn't fit neatly into any of the other genres, or it borrows from them while completely being its own thing. It's sometimes snobbishly thought of as the most literary of the spec-fic genres. Many of you will be familiar with Jeff Vandermeer. I think his Southern Reach tetralogy, 4 books, is the contemporary weird exemplar, and not racially problematic like some of his predecessors in the genre. I want to discuss 2 more stories by John Morrissey, 5 Minutes and Ivy, as very good examples of black weird fiction. And just like the flawed protagonists of Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach books, the rich interiority of his protagonists of 5 Minutes and Ivy holds just as much narrative weight as the story's immediate external action. Each story echoes the other 2 in terms of character and plot. Both protagonists are reclusive young men whose rich inner lives eventually take over their realities. They're antisocial weirdos who are preoccupied with health and hygiene. They both avoid their parents and both have unattainable romantic interests, perhaps reflecting the racial anxieties of black men dating white girls who are perceived to be above their station. 5 Minutes is hyper-conscious of genre and structure and plays with both through its 2 layers of reality. The primary story concerns Mikey, a misanthropic public servant who writes sci-fi, or rather mostly thinks about writing it, and the other takes place within the cosmic horror story he's imagining, of insectoid aliens coming to annihilate humanity, which then starts to take over his waking life. The 5 minutes of the title refers to the extra time on Earth the aliens agree to give blackfellas as acknowledgement of our long peace-loving existence after they extinguish the rest of humanity from the planet. When that time is up, though, our people are not killed, but abducted together and placed into a life-sized diorama, complete with the lost megafauna. It's as gorgeous as it is weird. While Mikey earns a salary and is preoccupied with aliens, the insomniac protagonist of Ivy is broke and unemployed, and he slowly merges his consciousness with the creeping plan of the title. He too creeps around, stalking people at a distance, and he only experiences genuine peace lying rooted to the earth with his eyes to the sky. As above, so below, soon Ivy is all that makes sense. Its fractal logic is symbolised by the tessellating vegetal patterns of the vine. He feels the plan as its spirit seems to flower and grow within him, and he also starts to see it everywhere without. Quote, "Often he was surprised by his own image in the glass doors that led from the kitchen to the garden. Behind his reflection he could see dark foliage and swollen ghostly white flowers." End quote. The ivy has real but alien autonomy in this story, quote, straining and growing as if it had adapted, like him, to feed on moonlight, end quote. These two fictional loners are both nihilists who suffer from repression and split personalities. They have unconventional romances or lopsided infatuations, depending who's asking, and they experience such extreme mental instability that they can't keep their actions and their fantasies totally straight. In the collisions between the inner and the outer worlds, John Morrissey shows the power that lurks beneath the surface of all people, which I think is a really important hallmark of black weird fiction, as our people have little to no power in the real world. Well, that's been a rundown of my thinking about the different subgenres of blackfella spec fic so far, and some of the research I've been lucky enough to do. It probably goes without saying that blackfella spec fic is very exciting to me. This field of literature is still small but growing exponentially. In the last 5 to 10 years, it's exploded in all genres. Our writers are increasingly finding more experimental and interesting ways to tell stories about who we are, where we have come from, and where we might be going. Black spec fic writers are publishing some truly fresh and nuanced stories about our countries, communities and cultures, past, present and future. And across all cultures, spec fic readers are lapping these stories up, and critics and scholars are increasingly engaging with our work too. I hope that my research not only generates interest in black spec fic and promotes our work being widely read, but like Janine Lane and Lisa Fuller called for, helps inform readers as I provide entry points for everyone to understand our stories in their proper cultural contexts. Boogawan, thank you for your presence and listening to me tonight. Boogabear and Nyambul to all of you.
Thank you so much, Michaela. That was fantastic. In my mind, I was trying to file away the titles of those books to either move them up the reading list or to add them to the reading list. I think I'll have to peruse your blog maybe to find the titles in there. So thank you very much for going through that. We now have some time for some questions. And I want to throw it to the floor first to see if anyone has a question they'd like to ask. I'd just like to let you know that we are recording this event tonight, so we have some roaming microphones on either side of the audience. Please wait to grab a microphone before you ask your question. That way, those who will watch online will be able to hear what you ask. Are there any in the audience at the moment? Going once, going twice. It's for me. Okay, I'd like to ask you a question. You spoke a lot about blackfella horror, talking about how the reality that we've lived to and our ancestors have lived through can be just as horrifying as, imaginary stories of horror. I wanted to ask you a question about what you think about when writing futuristic stories in futurism, the balance between maybe an ideal future for our people versus a realistic future for our people based on what has come before. Is there kind of hope to be gained in a world where, things might be all well and good, or, what's the balance between, basing it in, realities we know and we've experienced?
I think I have a few answers for this question, which is how my brain works. Nothing straightforward. I think there are going to be as many versions of the future as we have of the past. Everyone in this room has their idea of what happened in the past in history. And they're all going to be very different. They're going to focus on different things. And I think it's going to be the same with the future, probably even more so. What's going to happen in the future really depends on who you are, who your people are, what kind of resources you have access to, your attitude, all kinds of things, all the things that make up a life. Another answer I have to your question is there's not a lot of utopian stories being written, because unless they're kind of being cheeky and satirical and poking fun at things, they're pretty boring, right? Stories need conflict, drama, we love reading dystopian stories, horror stories. We like being frightened and, provoked and worried about things. I think even, what we think of as fairy tale endings, like fairy tales are very grim stories. They're very bloody. They're very, so I think that's the main answer for that in a storytelling sense. But when we think about utopia has always been a genre that is a little bit satirical. And the ones that, I don't know, for my personal taste, I don't know about everyone else, but when I read utopian stories about how amazing the world could be and everyone's happy and everything's beautiful, I mean, that's nice, but it's not a very good story,
Seems a little too shiny almost. There's something beneath the surface there. It's not quite real. How could it be, that real?
That's right. And I think whatever kind of futures we're all meeting, because there's not going to be one future, it's going to be very personal, even though we're going to be sharing futures to a certain extent. Even when it's bad and horrible, there's going to be people with senses of humour, people who can remember the joy and find the joy. And even when it's good, there's going to be bad things that happen to good people. So, it's mix of everything.
Yeah, amazing. Just keeping my eye on the audience. Please just raise your hand if you have any questions. We've still got a bit of time. At the front, microphone for guest at the front.
Thanks, Michaela. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering something you could elaborate on that I've been thinking about myself, and I think it happens a lot down here just because bunyips are from down here and over-capitalised on and commercialised and things like that. Just elaborate on your thoughts on how to do that ethically and in a way that doesn't, exclude people from it or do it unethically, I guess.
Are you asking how to write about these creatures in a way? Okay. I think, so I mentioned two stories, bush horror stories, one by Kayla Murray and one by Lisa Fuller. And they do it, I think, in really great ways where the horror of these creatures is really implied. You don't look at the creature face on. It's not described. You don't know what it looks like, where it lives. But the horror is from it being kind of just off stage and the threat of it. And the stories are creepy and, they do it really well and in a really respectful way. I know a writer, I won't mention because I haven't asked permission to share this story, but I do know a writer who writes horror and thinks about this stuff really deeply and actually asked family and other elders about the use of certain cultural creatures and she actually decided not to because she didn't want to be the writer writing about this and then these fictional stories being taken as like accounts of what, So one thing I've found when our writers are writing into spec fic genres, they are making stuff up, even though it might be alluding to or based on something. So a lot of I know Graham Ackhurst in Borderland, he totally made up this creature. It's not based on a cultural thing, but people think it is because it's so well done. It's got a history and a lore and everything. And I think that's probably the way to do it, to just make stuff up because, we've got imaginations. I think when writing about, stuff that people take seriously for an outsider audience, I think it's probably best to talk to older people who hold the knowledge of that story, and the answer will probably mostly be no, depending on how you do it. And that's what I think.
Any additional questions from our audience? I work a lot with young people in helping them find their path, primarily in the sciences, but in other roles, across all kind of disciplines and areas, figuring out what it is that they want to do, where are they going to go, what are their goals. And I wanted to ask you about what your journey was as a young person or getting into speculative fiction. Did you write when you were younger? What was that experience?
I wrote my first spec fic story in 2017. The reason I started on this journey, I will tell a little story about this, but From 2012 to 2014, I was doing my master's at Sydney Uni. I was studying transgenerational trauma and healing in my community, looking at the way past government policies affected people and how that's kind of travelled through family and community. And, you know, obviously I was thinking very much about government policies and what they intended to do and the effects of them on our people. So I had that in my head, and it was actually very spiritually damaging research for me. I didn't have a supervisor who cared very much about my well-being through it. I didn't have safety nets in place, people to talk to, because I lived away from my community. It was very hard. So I had this experience of doing this research, which I loved, but it did have a huge effect on me, and I thought about it very deeply. And it made me not want to go on to do my doctorate in history and trauma and education and all that stuff. I wanted to change fields. I always thought I was a creative person. I used to paint and draw. But I'd been thinking about what to do for my doctorate. I thought about it for a few years. Well, in the year, I think it was 2015 or 2016, I never remember, but Mad Max Fury Road came out. And oh my God, so amazing. Love it. Love all Mad Max, always have. But I remember, in light of my research, watching it with a critical eye and realising there was only one blackfella in this world, in the future Australia, and he was dead. He was a ghost. And he accuses Mad Max in his delirium. He says, "You let us die." And I thought that is the perfect metaphor for how our people are represented in the future, on this country, on our countries, you know. And yeah, it put a fire in my belly. And so I thought I wanted to start reading black spec fic. And so I started trying to find stuff. And there wasn't a lot written about it. There wasn't a lot available. I actually looked to some North American anthologies. I wanted to see what Indigenous people around the world were writing about. And it really excited me. Like, I can't tell you, like, way more than what my master's research was. That was not exciting. It made me sad, you know. This was exciting. So I talked to potential supervisors at Sydney Uni in 2016, and I said, I've got this project, I want to do it. And they were like, okay, cool, creative writing, what have you written? I was like, I haven't. I mean, I'd written stuff on an old blog when I used to review albums and stuff, but not creative writing. I didn't really know about the craft of fiction beyond what we all know from reading and absorbing stories. I've never studied it. So they said I could get into the program on the condition I took a few workshop classes, which I really loved, you know. I took 2 fiction workshop classes. I learnt to write stories in those classes. One was Terra Nora, another was River Story. They're both in my book. And I loved it. I loved learning from teachers and other students. And then the training wheels were off, and I was experimenting and writing my own stuff. And yeah, so that's how I became interested in spec fic and writing my own, from hating study, which probably a lot of people can understand. But once you find something you love, as you know from working with young people, that's it. You just got to figure it out.
And I think it's a great example of the way that you can change course if you like. You know, you don't have to be locked into the one thing that you started, and you know that passion can really drive you down a different path, and you can find great comfort and great success. Yeah. That brings us to the end of our time today for this lecture. Thanks to Science Gallery for hosting the 2025 Hugh D.T. Williamson Lecture. Thank you to Stephen and other members of the Foundation for attending tonight. And a huge thank you, and can we put our hands together again for Dr. Michaela Saunders.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for all coming. It's really nice to see all your beautiful faces here. Yeah, ta.
There will be books outside that Michaela will be able to sign, so make sure you stay around. Thank you very much for coming again.